All right, welcome to a special edition of SOC Sidebar, live from the Federalist Society's National Lawyers Convention. I'm your host, Matthew Holmes, and I have the pleasure of serving as the president of the University of Michigan Federalist Society Student Chapter. Today, we're swapping out the case books for card binders, as we're joined by Judge Paul Matey of the United States Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit. Now, Judge Matey is more than just a sharp legal thinker. He's also a lifelong baseball fan and card collector, with a collection spanning decades, teams, and just a little bit of obsession. So whether you're here to talk about precedent or penance, you've come to the right place. Judge Matey, let's play ball. So let's start from the beginning. How did baseball first become part of your life?
Well, first, Matthew, thanks for doing this today. Thanks for the pleasure of being here. Normally, when we come to the FedSoc, you can expect intellectual challenge and rich, rigorous, classical debate. The idea that we get to talk about baseball cards is far more exciting, and so I'm really pleased to be here. When did I get started? Well, dating myself, but back in 1982, the Topps Corporation, which is the main retailer and provider of these things, put out this wonderful sticker album. And it allowed you to put in about 8 or 9 players per team. And the sticker album was 25 cents, and the packs themselves were 20 cents. And this was just really right within my 8 or 9-year-old budget. And I found it just captivating. It was a way to sort of experience the sport through a lens that I hadn't seen before. And this is obviously before digital, this is before cable, this is before the internet. And so it was very easy to not know much about the players or the game in particular without having something tangible to look at. And so the sticker album really was my gateway into this obsession.
That's fantastic. So who's your team and how did this fandom begin?
Yeah, so we all make mistakes in life, but growing up in the New York, so I grew up in New Jersey, live in New Jersey still, and at the time, really, you kind of divided yourself in either to the Yankees or the Mets, and if you were sort of that popular, cool kid, you rooted for the Yankees, right? If you were the other kid, you followed the Mets, and so I spent most of my childhood kind of as a lukewarm follower of the pinstripes.
So you were a cool kid.
No, well, that's the problem, right? I was absolutely not the cool kid, and I never liked front runners, and I always rooted for the underdog. And so I never felt a real connection to the Yankees. I mean, they had the players, Thurman Munson, Ron Guidry, Reggie Jackson, Mattingly, you could go on and on. But the sum of the parts never felt as compelling as the individual. So I was always in the market for a better partner. And in 2005, after clerking, I came down to DC to start practicing. And that was, of course, the same year that the Montreal Expos finished their wandering across the globe and landed here in Washington. And it was everything I was actually looking for in a team. It was a bunch of cast-off veterans like Vinny Castilla and Cristian Guzman that nobody knew. They were playing at RFK, the old football stadium. And for a while, they were actually pretty good. They were 500 going into the All-Star break. And I thought, okay, I'm home. And this is what I want to do. So I've been following the Nationals now since, for 20 years. And so far, it's been a pretty good investment. 1 World Series, a couple of postseason appearances in 2 decades. Not so bad.
No,
not so bad.
No, not so bad at all. So there's been a huge shift in how baseball's played with things like sabermetrics, exit velocity, launch angles, WAR, etc. Are you a big stats guy? Can we get your take on that?
So like most things in the law, the more that the law is reduced to its positive form, the less rich and important it becomes. Statistics have always been a way of helping us understand the game, much like the reduced law to writing has always been a way of kind of capturing concepts, determinations, if you will. But what we have now is kind of an in-game obsession with play that I think is largely derivative of other entertainment products like sports betting. that doesn't add much to the experience. So sure, I'm like anybody else, I'm particularly interested in things like wins over replacement. Like if we look at player A and we look at player B, how much would we have to pay player B to replicate the performance of this person we're getting away? That's an intriguing way to think about the game, and certainly things like batting averages and steals and whatnot. It's nice to know how your players are performing. But now we're looking at a thing of like, well, how fast did the ball exit the park when it was hit? How much of a lead is the runner at first taking? I think that's just distracting. I think it winds up taking us away from the basics of the game, the fundamentals, and the sort of experience that you perceive when you watch the game live. There's now an enormous gulf between going to a ballpark, going to whether it's major league or your local little league field, and seeing how the game is played, and watching it on television, which is just sort of an endless series of interruptions and distractions. That's not consistent with what I think was supposed to be the great American pastime.
That's a great answer. So a fun connection for me is Billy Beane, the guy who's credited with really bringing sabermetrics into Major League Baseball, is a graduate of Mount Carmel High School, where I'm also a graduate of Mount Carmel High School, so we share that fun connection. The next question I have for you is, you mentioned in our prep call that you think that baseball is a cautionary tale for what happens when common law gets overtaken by codification. Can you expand upon that?
Well, of course I can, and let me not pass up an opportunity to make a plug for the common law. And I think it sort of touches upon what we were just sort of going over. That when we think about the American legal tradition, right, it builds obviously on the English and more importantly perhaps Roman and Greek legal traditions, where the law was understood to be something that resonated from first principles, that was connected to human flourishing, that was designed towards ever moving towards the common good. The reductionist expression of positivism that begins in the 1900s and really grips us with a fury probably even till today was one way of thinking about the law. But it was certainly not the entirety of the law as was commonly understood by lawyers and citizens of republics then and now. Baseball, as we start talking about the statistical obsession, I think it begins to suffer from the same flaw that positivism does. It is too reductionist. It takes the art of determination and turns it into something that is concrete expression as opposed to symbolic of what the intent was. And so, we talked about sabermetrics and this whole move that came up really in the 2000s to sort of say, what if we're thinking about the game altogether wrong? We ultimately just want to win, and you win by scoring runs, and it turns out you don't really care how it is you score the run, and all you have to do is get to first and then make it all the way home. And so whether you hit a home run or you get to first on a walk or a hit by pitch, does it really make a difference? And the answer, of course, is no. But in one sense it does, right? Because it changes how the rest of the game gets played. And so the idea that we could then use that insight, which seems fairly obvious in retrospect, as a touchstone for understanding every aspect of the game, to me seems the same flaw of modern positivism, that if we continue to just reduce to language, we can always, through the art of interpretation, find purity and meaning. I just think the law is much richer than that, and so too is the game.
Okay, wow, that was a phenomenal answer. So next year,
I can talk about common law and baseball all day. We're going to actually extend this panel to about 5 tonight, so just hunker down.
So next year, the Major League Baseball will be adopting an automated ball strike challenge system. You talked about how things being too deterministic or too fixed, too rigid. Do you have that same response to an automated ball strike appeal system?
So we're stuck in this system now, right? I mean, people have been arguing about whether somebody was out, whether the tag was too late, or whether a pitch was a strike since people first started throwing balls at each other. We are in this predicament because of high definition and video replay, where now, over the course of a laborious 7 minutes after the play happens, we can watch and say, yes, it turns out that pitch did not clip the strike zone in the upper outside corner. And so now we know, right? And so because of that, because we are possessed of that knowledge, we think we have to put in a computerized umpiring system. I mean, this is just doubling down the wrong path, right? I mean, there was always indeterminacy in the game. That's what made it so rich. There was always indeterminacy in the law. too. And so this is why I've never quite understood what was meant by the famous judges just call balls and strikes analogy. But anyone who's played baseball or watches baseball knows that the first thing that happens when a pitcher comes into the game is he throws about 5 or 7 warm-up pitches. And for each of those, the umpire makes a call. Ball, strike, inside, low. And the point is he's letting the pitcher and the catcher know, here's how I'm going to call the game. It's never the same strike zone. It's this strike zone. And all the players care about and all the fans really want is that the strike zone, as it is set at the moment, continues consistently through the course of the game. There is no, in other words, perfectly established strike zone, and that's what we're now trying to create through the ABS system. I think it's going to just make us less interested in the actual flow of the game and less dependent on the human elements of all of it. And I don't know why at some point people are going to want to watch that.
Right. No, I think that's great. So I'm a high school football official, and I always say the best thing you can be is correct. The second best thing you can be is consistent. And I think that your explanation of the strike zone speaks to that perfectly. Judge Elrod and I had a conversation about this a couple weeks ago about how the strike zone is more than just right or wrong. It also rewards the art of catching. And I think to your point that if we go completely to an automated ball strike system, framing a strike is no longer a skill that a catcher needs. So a lot lost there. Yeah. That's excellent. The last thing we're going to talk about before we move into a conversation about baseball cards specifically is this debate around the salary cap. Do we need a salary cap? And follow up, are we going to get one?
We are not going to get one. We may not get baseball in 2027 as a result, but I don't think we're going to see that kind of intervention in the market. Look, market constraints and market controls are part of a rationally functioning economic system. So I don't have a problem with the idea of putting in leverages that try to facilitate competitive balance. But we know there's a problem, right? We know that the Dodgers are spending $350 million this year, which is about $84 million more than they spent last year, which is some 2 times the average of all other teams. But yet we've seen 9 different World Series champions in the last 12 seasons. So maybe spending isn't the full problem. What I think the real problem is the lack of a salary floor. The Nationals spent $100 million last year. The woeful Miami Marlins spent $67 million. The Baltimore Orioles spent about $160 million, which is the same amount of tax that the Dodgers paid for their exorbitant payroll last year. So one thing I think you could see, and that you definitely need, is a recalibration of the competitive balance tax or the luxury tax, make it more costly to spend more money. And the second is to come up with a salary floor. The idea that a Major League Baseball team that enjoys a monopoly that is granted to it by the law is spending less than $100 million to put out a product, that can't be right, and that should be inconsistent with the public regulatory goals and the fans' expectations, who spent an enormous amount of money on this. The second thing I think it'll be interesting to see is how contracts are regulated, right? I mean, the big switch that we've seen in the last couple of years was the Shohei Ohtani contract, where he was granted a $700 million contract, which, as near as I can tell, is a lot of money. But what made it really interesting was it was only $680 million of it that wasn't deferred. So he got $20 million, but he gets $680 million is going to get paid by the Dodgers somewhere down the line. Why would he do that? Well, because he's making so much money from New Balance and all of his other endorsements that he doesn't need it. Why would the Dodgers do it? Because they don't, time value of money and all that, right? They can afford to spend on others and pay him later and probably just bank, $100 million and be able to make good on the contract when it comes due. That's going to really change the way that teams think about things and the kinds of investors who want to get involved with sport. And I wonder if we're ready for the era of private equity owning baseball, because that seems like what's going to happen next. If you can do these kinds of contracts, then why wouldn't a conglomerate of wealth come together to say, let's put together a $2 billion baseball team, because it'll only actually cost us $50 million up front. We can float the rest. And is that what we really want for something that is supposed to be a pastime for our kids?
I think I saw a statistic, and the Dodgers luxury tax alone was greater than I think 10 ball clubs payments and salaries across the board. That strikes me as wrong, but I'm a Padres fan, so I'm of course very bitter.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry to hear that. No.
All right, so now we're going to move into the baseball card portion of this conversation. I think that it's going to be hard to tops this. I'm sorry. No, I'm not sorry. So what does your collection look like now? How many cards
Am I supposed to not just
Thousands?
stare? I'm just going to stare at that.
There's no jurist on this, but there is a judge.
The jokes don't get better as the day goes on. Tell me again.
Yeah, so what does your collection look like now? Are we talking thousands of cards?
Yeah, at this point, it's gotten up there. I mean, it's dispersed between binders and boxes and long cardboard holders, and then just piles that randomly exist in my closet. So yeah, there's a lot.
Do you have a system to how you organize it, or is it what some collectors call an organizational system only I understand?
I think it's the same system that most every collector uses, which it is precise and predictable, except when I don't want it to be, which is sort of how I approach judging as well, now that I think about it. Yeah, most of it is organized by year and by set. So Topps Heritage 2021 gets its own tab in the binder, which is separate from Topps Stadium Club 2023, which gets its own tab in the next binder. And then there's team sets that go in separate boxes, and then there's I have to get around to sorting them. And then my friend Ryan Goodwin, who's here today too, and I were talking about just a few days ago, every now and then you just resort the whole thing. You realize, like, hold on a moment, I started with the earliest set, but I really should start with the most recent. Let me take them all out over the course of several months and put everything back together again, only to decide that, no, perhaps that's not perfect either. That's why they call it a hobby, I guess.
So this came up in our prep call. What can collecting cards tell us about rational living in the 21st century?
Well, that not everything, that while everything has to be ordered to human flourishing and our most important basic needs, not everything needs to be an intellectual endeavor or something that is ordered to the highest possible good. When we were first talking about a subject for this, and it was, what do you do when you're not judging? What do you do when you're not in your law? What's your main hobby? And my first answer was, well, church. The mass and being part of my parish community is the most important part of my week, so we could talk about that. But I wanted to sort of talk about something that I think kind of distinguishes us uniquely as human creatures, which is our ability to not only see the divine in the ordinary, but to pursue the ordinary simply because it's enjoyable, right? Not everything has to be the law all the time. So, while we'll talk about analogies between cards and judicial writing, while we can make connections between the law and baseball, as has been done over and again, the real answer is it has nothing to do with any of that. It's just fun, and it's okay to just have fun outside of our roles as members and citizens of the Republic and as stewards and custodians of the law. So I think a big part of ordered living is simply knowing when you can enjoy this great and beautiful gift that we've been given by God for the kinds of things that are just simply pleasurable.
That's awesome. And I'm sorry to ask this next question because I feel like it directly draws a parallel. But you've compared digging boxes, through boxes of old cards to legal research. Can you explain this parallel?
So if you've ever collected anything, that special thrill of driving down the street and seeing the garage sale, right? There it is. And you have to stop because who knows, maybe today under that table next to the ironing board and behind the box fan is that cardboard box with cards in it. And in there could be that treasure, that one-of-a-kind thing that only you will recognize, and then you will be able to add to your cardboard boxes that live behind the ironing board, right? And so that to me is kind of the thrill of legal research. And when I approach the law, I always do it from first principles forward. What is driving this train? What is pulling this as far back as we can identify it? And so that means we spend a lot of times in books and treatises and old codes. And so I look at it as the sort of same process when you can find that insight that says, there it is. Now we know where this principle came from. Now we understand why Congress acted. Now we know why the court so held. It reminds me of that same thrill that you get when you are once again moving, through a box, sifting through a box of cards, thinking, maybe today will be the day that card that I once had, that I sold, shows back up in my possession.
Awesome. Well, now it is time for the rapid fire random ripping round. Say that 3 times fast. So, somebody told me before law school that law school kills creativity. That is so wrong, and we're going to prove it right here, right now, because you know what? I can do arts and crafts too. Why don't you break that open?
This is such a great, this is so great. This is why when I told my wife, look, I'm going to be away for 3 days, I have a very important conference to go to. And she said, oh, what's the topic? I said, baseball cards. I think a spa day will be in her future, is my guess. Oh, see, right there, that's what you're looking for. Now, I'm showing the proper way. You're coming down, right, and then you're going to take from here. You're never going to touch the corners, right? You're always going to hold like
Keep 'em
that.
crisp.
And then if you want, you can do this just to make sure everything is done. And so now we have appropriately held them. I pass them back to you.
Awesome. So on the front, we've got our baseball cards, and on the back, I've pasted on some rapid-fire questions that we're going to go through really quickly and get Judge Matey's takes. So question number 1, what's your best pack pull story? That one moment that you still relive like it's a walk-off home run. That's the Giants. Any Giants fans in the crowd?
I'm still thinking of the walk-off home run that I never had, actually. So there was 2. So I found a complete 2016 Topps Chrome Washington Nationals set to give to my son, who was born in 2016, because I knew that he would want this as part of his lifelong Nationals fandom. And so when I came across this, I was shocked, because finding a complete set of that particular run is really hard, and particularly for the Nationals, it's really difficult, because who cares about the Nationals other than me, right? And so I was really thrilled to find that, and was really proud when we hung it in his room, and then slightly sadder when we took it down, because he decided that he'd rather root for the Mets. That's going to be his misfortune. And now it sits in my closet with the ironing board and the other stuff we've mentioned. So yeah, I'll go with that one.
All right, so the next question is, if someone is brand new to this hobby, what's the first piece of advice you'd give them?
Well, you understand you are not doing this to become wealthy. This is not Bitcoin. It's not crypto. Like, don't fall into the prey of yet another commercialization of the things that are just small and joyous in life. The biggest problem with the hobby is that in the 1990s, it started to shift away from childhood consumers to adults. And it's fine. I mean, it's fine for adults to be part of this, but it is problematic that it is now largely looked at as an auxiliary to your stock portfolio. Do it just because it's fun. Do it just because that moment of opening these up and saying, like, I wonder who's in here, is what keeps you closer connected to both the game and your own childhood. The second is to just understand you can't get them all. There was a time as kids you might have said, look, I'm going to get all of the Yankees cards this year, or I want all of the Red Sox cards this year. It's just not possible anymore. They make too many of them. They make too many variants. They design it like lottery tickets or gambling so that you're always chasing after that unknown. So you're going to have to just put aside your completist instinct and instead go with what you find passionate.
All right, we've about 5 minutes left, so we're going to go true rapid fire here. If you had to rebrand your chambers as a ball club, what name would you choose?
The Blackstones.
The Blackstones. We got New York Yankees. I'm sure there's some Yankee fans in the house. All right, do your kids collect with you, or do they just shake their heads and say, oh, look, there's Dad's cardboard museum?
No, my son is fully into this, and for those of you who were once in the hobby and sort of fell far from it because you grew up, kids are the portal back in. And so now it's, hey, Danny, can we go to the store and get a box of baseball cards? Yes, indeed we can, son. Yes, we can.
If there was a FedSoc rookie card series, what stats would appear on the back?
Well, I tend to think of the most important work in my job is the mistakes that are avoided and the errors contrary to fundamental human law that are not written. So I'm going to say something like runners held on base, errors avoided. I also think it's important, in most opinions, to not take the easy way out. You want to try to get to the right answer, as best designed and is originally understood. And so I would say something like, running out the ball's hit. Nothing is more annoying watching the game than seeing the guy who, just sort of trots to first base as rather than sprinting, even if it's going to be a clear out. Well, so too the judge who lazily only half engages with first principles and resorts to that, that most awful of reasoning, which is just what some other court did instead.
I got an Acuna card. That's pretty cool.
Yeah,
do you think that today's kids are missing out on the gum, or are their dentists better off?
So I'm glad that there's some laughter there, because I sort of wondered if anyone would get that reference. Like, there was a time, and wait for it, of course I have it. There was a time when, this was 1989, when the packs of, and so yes, of course I have a random unopened pack of cards from 1989 sitting around, which we'll open live. And yeah, this is what 30-year-old gum looks like, right? And that's because the cards were basically promotional opportunities for the candy. Before that it was actually tobacco, and that was the way that these things were sold. Yeah, I think they are. I mean, they don't put them in anymore because the gum mars the cards, it leaves an imprint, they all smell like bubble gum, and adults don't want that, and so we've ruined everything for kids as well. If you put it back in, it would make it much more accessible, and you could make it healthier or whatever, but it would draw kids back in a way that I think they're missing out on simply by making it fun. Look, I get cards and candy, like what could be better?
That's awesome. All right, this next part's really fun. Now batting for the court, number 3, Paul Matey. If you had a judicial walk-up song, what would it be and why?
We've actually talked about this at home because my son plays, and he, he's a big fan of the band Linkin Park, and so that's what he wants, is something sort of heavy and grinding. But my wife came up with a great answer to this question. She said Tim McGraw's Truck Yeah, that opening. And I thought, man, that would really be good. So I'm all for it if you can find a way to get the Judicial Conference to embrace this principle. We could come striding out and, that'd be great.
If I see the Chief Justice, I'll bring
Please
it up.
do. Yeah.
All right, we have 2 more questions and then we'll close. In baseball, statistics never tell the whole story. I'm sure you agree with that.
Yeah.
There are multiple ways to define success. I want to know, how do you define success as a judge?
Constraining myself to the original principles that were understood by the founders based on their study of the classical sources that inspired them to create a republic. This is a great card, by the way. Yeah, I think the more we tie ourselves to those foundational thoughts, the closer we are keeping law connected to what's important, which is the same thing I think in the game. The small plays are the ones that still matter the most, the cleanly fielded hit, the pick off at first. These are the things that kind of get our hearts soaring, because we see how difficult it is to do those little small things. So I would say it's the small things that matter most.
Fantastic. And you probably didn't see, but he's a Washington Nationals fan. It just so happens the last card is a Washington Nationals card. Yeah. So, closing question. Over time, a collection becomes more than the sum of its parts. I think you explicitly said that, actually. Do you think of your judicial writing the same way? And if so, what do you hope endures?
Consistency and predictability aligned with as what Blackstone, the namesake of most of our common law tradition here, as well as my team, called the reason and spirit of the law. As conservatives, we should not fear that standard. It is, in fact, the closest resonant of the natural law expression that people like John Adams told us, and James Wilson prophesied were going to be necessary for a republic built on virtue. So I do think that there is a consistency that can come from it, and that's what I hope that my chambers is part of.
Awesome. Well, let's wrap it up. In the end, baseball cards are more than just cardboard. They're stories, moments, and memories preserved in time. Judge Matey reminds us that the same is true of the law. Behind every opinion, there are human stories worth remembering. Thank you so much for joining us for this special edition of SOC Sidebar, live from the Federalist Society National Lawyers Convention. I'm Matthew Holmes. Until next time, keep your corners crisp and your convictions even crisper.